Welcome to the McAlvany Vault, where we revisit classic shows and highlights from 2008 and on. While you're listening, remember to thumb this video up, share with your friends, and leave a comment or question down below.
We either are going to wake up and start to restructure things so as to reduce these risks, or they are going to destroy the economic vitality of our people. And I mean that quite literally. What is required is political courage, the kind that's entirely absent from leadership now on all sides. All these people want to do is pretend that one more bailout, one more tinkering that stuffs a little money in somebody's pockets on a temporary basis or takes it out of somebody's pocket on a temporary basis is going to solve the problem, when in point of fact the whole structure of socialism that has been the prevailing wind since at least the mid-20th century has got to be changed.
Welcome to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick along with David McAlvany. And David, obviously everyone right now is in wait for this bailout of all bailouts, this taxpayer travesty. What are your thoughts right now about what Wall Street's waiting for and the Main Street?
Frankly, Kevin, for any of our listeners who enjoy history, this is history in the making. We're watching major transitions, not only the level of finance and economics, but socially and politically as well. The expectation of the man on the street is quickly becoming, what will government do for me? And so we have what really is on the brink of constitutional breach as we move towards absolute power and a place where, frankly, we wouldn't even have judicial review. And I'm specifically speaking about the bailout plan that has been proposed by Paulson and Bernanke. If it is approved by Congress, sweeping controls will be handed to the Federal Reserve, and we will see the taxpayer take the primary risk. We're looking at $700 billion as a starting point. That's what's being asked for. And Paulson has already said that's by no means the limit, but we need to ensure that we have a good starting spot. Kevin, if you recall, the war that we're in now in Iraq was estimated at about 1/10 of what we've currently spent. So 10 times, 9 to 10 times, the original estimate is what we've spent on this war. My guess is that we're going to spend 5 times what's estimated in terms of what will this cost the taxpayer.
Well, haven't we opened a Pandora's box when we come out and actually say, and this is literally a quote, we're literally days away from a complete meltdown. That's what Hank Paulson said. So when you open up that box and you tell the world that we're days away from a complete meltdown and the only solution is $700 billion of taxpayer money. I mean, and they're already just loosely talking about it being more than $1 trillion if you count the other bailouts.
Well, Kevin, I think the major flaw in this is that they're looking at this as the same thing as an RTC-style bailout. And the key difference is that we're not talking about real assets backing the RTC. We're not talking about strip malls and businesses and banks and homes that are going into the portfolio of the RTC. We're talking about crap paper, just absolute garbage paper.
It has no value.
Toxic waste, which was structured by Wall Street in order to be some sort of an insurance against this very set of scenarios which is unfolding. And so what is backing the paper? And when you say nothing, you have to wonder, well, then how is it that an RTC-style bailout, where if you hold the asset long enough, it will return to its previous value? The previous value was fiction to begin with, Kevin.
Is this really just a delay to a collapse? Is what we're seeing right now a perception management to keep us from having a complete crisis this week or next week? The stock market looked like it was melting down last week, and gold was skyrocketing, so something was happening.
I think Wall Street and Washington are doing everything that they know how to do, and they don't know how to handle this. This is beyond the scope of their education. There's no PhD that prepares you for this. There's no amount of time that you can spend on Wall Street in order to know how to deal with what's happening in the financial markets today, because it's never happened before. 1929 was tame in comparison to what is happening today, because there was not the degree of leverage that we have today, and there was not the creative finance that's been introduced over the last few years. Now, granted, the SEC and the groups that are supposed to manage this, they really should be scrutinized and lambasted through and over this, because they made this happen. It was just a few years ago that they allowed your main Wall Street firms, 3 of the 5 which they allowed this are now gone. Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, and Bear Stearns were all allowed, along with Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs to more than double their leverage. This was not a bank policy saying, let's see how far we can stretch it. This was a governmental mandate. This is the SEC saying, it's okay by us if you double your risk.
Now, Goldman and Morgan Stanley are gone. I mean, at this point, they're not gone, but they're now commercial banks, and no longer do we have the investment bank.
So, Kevin, I think you could sum up the current crisis by saying this. We are in the mother of all bailouts. We know that. Mm-hmm. And the mother of all bailouts equals one thing. We have just ensured the death of the dollar and inflation moving from a moderate phase, which we've been in, to hyperinflation over the next 2 to 3 years.
At any moment. I mean, we don't know when that switch will get flipped. But at any moment, the dollar could drop into the hyperinflation that we talked about with Jim Deeds a number of times in the last 6 years.
The government is now monetizing debt, and that reduces the value of all outstanding dollars. So while this may save the stock market, it has ensured the death of the dollar. And our foreign creditors know that. So, Kevin, let's transition, and we've got on this week's schedule Alan Keyes. We're very much looking forward to the interview.
Ambassador to the UN.
He spent time in the Reagan administration.
And he's a presidential candidate at this time. And he's been very clear on his message for many years, uncompromising. He says that this system needs a systemic change to bring about true results.
Fundamental reform are the things that he's focused on in every area, whether it's politics, economics, the tax code, and he's a man who, like we would expect of a good statesman, is actually focused on the real issues. With so many things happening on Wall Street, in the financial markets, in the economy, it would be easy to fall prey to the tyranny of the urgent. There's so many things that seem to need immediate attention. Maybe we need to pause and reflect. What is really happening? What really should be our answer to the pressing questions of the day?
Well, I think the most important thing to me is that we mustn't let present distractions, present events, distract us from the fact that we need fundamental reform in the structures that affect our economic and financial life. The banking system, the income tax, things of this kind that I think place a burden on our freedom and productivity and the prospects for the future that cannot be changed by the tinkering that is suggested by so-called political leaders these days, because it's not going to do any good.
As far as the tinkering goes, a lot of the intervention that's happening in the financial markets right now, a lot of people would claim that that's taxpayer money going towards something that should have been taken on the shoulders of private investors and private corporations. What are your thoughts right now?
I agree with that, but I think that arises from the fact that we want to ignore where the problem is coming from. Consider that major structures like Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, all of these things, what are they really? They are quasi-government corporations. Mm-hmm. They are banks that operate for the sake of private profit in many cases, but with a lot of political and bureaucratic influence, if not control, and, of course, regulation. So you have a situation then where this system of kind of quasi-government corporate life produces a disaster, yes? And what are we told by our leaders? That what we need is more government regulation.
Right.
I think this is insane. It's a little bit like what happens with some of the drugs now in the health field, where they say, well, here's a drug that's going to help you, and then that drug produces all kinds of bad side effects, and they want to give you more drugs to help deal with that. And you end up having a system in which the money is being made by curing you of the problems that have been caused by their previous cures. And I think that's exactly what's happening in our financial system right now.
We fixed the hangnail but destroyed your liver in the process. Exactly. We're so sorry.
Well, what we need to be asking ourselves is, what is the fundamental problem that is creating this context in which we end up paying out of our pockets for the mistakes that result from a government system funded out of our pockets? And I think the answer to that question is we've got to get back control of our money. We've got to get back control of our financial structures. We've got to take that control away from government and away from an international banking system that is no longer in the least little way responsive to the interests of the American people.
You know, it's interesting. Ambrose Evans Pritchard just wrote that the root cause lies in the actions of the governments worldwide, where the central banks have kept interest rates artificially low for 20 years, and now it's creating an amazing amount of pain. Dr. Keyes, you've been a proponent for years of the abolition of the income tax, but John Maynard Keynes said that inflation is also it's a tax that only 1 in a million understands. How would you recommend that be cured in the future? Is that an abolition of central banking, an abolition of the Federal Reserve?
I think step number one, we need to make sure that we are not dealing with a situation in which the value of our money is being determined entirely by the profiteering whim of a little clique of people acting in their own interest. That's the kind of banking system we now have. And whether that interest is an interest that includes, the banks, the corporations, and so forth and so on, it is not the general interest of our people.
When you look at the kind of crisis that we have today on Wall Street and the way that translates into a very high probable outcome of greater socialism, not less freedom, as government solves the problem, comes in and solves the problem, and ends the experience of pain in the general public and by the general public. How would you strategize, if you will, a more positive outcome where, as faith-oriented people, we can engage with culture in the midst of pain and direct them towards being more self-reliant, not more government-dependent, taking responsibility for their own actions, not letting someone else stand in the gap for them? I think the need for leadership will be great, but defining the issue is pretty critical.
I think that the first challenge, and I think about this a lot, because the first thing that I think we have to do in this circumstance is to try to get people, insofar as we can find them, who want to think about what's really important to them, right? And we are in a situation where, to be manipulated, we must accept the notion that what is most important to us is our material condition, yes? How much money you have in your wallet and what's going to happen to it and so forth and so on. To the extent that we accept that understanding, we are then looking away from what we actually believe is important, because if you examine what leads most people to care about the money and the job and the work and the success of the enterprise, it really has to do with relationships in which their caring is not about the material thing, but about this person whose happiness they care about and that person whose future they would like to secure. You see what I'm saying? So at the end of the day, the real priority is that we should be able successfully to contribute to, take responsibility for, help with individuals with whom we have those kinds of relationships. But that means, at the end of the day, our real priority, and the one that has given the impetus to the success of our economic life, is a moral priority, not a material one. And we live in a world, by the way, in which, for various reasons, ranging from terrorism and things like that, all the way over to the direct assaults that are taking place on basic ideas of family life and other things. We live in a world in which moral preoccupation is very close to the minds of many people. A matter of fact, one of the striking factors, 2.5 years ago, when they were doing polls, the number one issue on the mind of the American people was the moral condition of the country. Since that time, we've been battered by all these manufactured economic crises, and of course that has once again changed for the time being. But underlying it all, that is still the truth. Sitting around the dinner table, talking to each other when nothing else at stake, most people get around to making in some way or another the clear point that a lot of these problems are rooted in moral factors. I find it interesting, for instance, that the whole mortgage thing, right, has a lot of people sort of at some common sense level realizing that part of what was going on here was people who were anxious to live a life that was beyond their means. And folks will say that. They know that that's really what's going on, right? Well, that's a form of moral indiscipline. Yes?
Correct.
And at the end of the day, we know that it has something to do with this crisis. We can see all the ways it's been exploited for profit, all the ways in which government structures and regulatory things didn't do what they were supposed to do, or maybe did, who knows, and so forth. But at bottom, we also realize that, like many other things in life, the trap that kills you is the one you step into. And if you have the sense and discipline not to step into it, then you're not going to be in that problem. And so I think that one of the key challenges right now is to try, in spite of everything that's going on, to focus people on and make them confident in their sense of that moral priority. That, of course, you have to do through discussing these economic things, but you must make sure that you don't give in to the temptation to do it as if they're isolated from these more fundamental factors.
Well, and going back to Aristotle, whether it's talking about economics and politics, his book on happiness, the Eudaimonia Ethics, what is eudaimonia? What is happiness? Well, we've had competing views, and much of that has, as you just said, been tied into material well-being and a notion of the good life, which is, frankly, a fantasy and very disconnected with the things we really do care about, family, relationships.
Well, see, this is one of the things that I think has been most dismaying about recent events, because if there was a hope that, in some immediate sense, this kind of thing would be presented in a way that had its ability to move people, that was effectively arising in the context of some of the real circumstances that we're dealing with, but at the same time took seriously the set of issues that address the moral and spiritual dimension, that was what should have been going on and should have been offered by the Republican Party. But sadly, I think culminating in the choice of McCain, the party has abandoned the effort, and what's left of it is simply being used to manipulate people for political purposes. It has no real substance anymore. And so in that sense, we face a challenge of trying to push forward substantive leadership that will do what the Republicans promised to do and never did.
Well, we're very interested to know the speech that you're preparing on the real meaning of economics. If there's a way for our listeners to be privy to that speech, to see a copy of the speech, perhaps you can let us know how they can to stay afoot of that.
I have a website, AlanKeyes.com, and a lot of the things that I do will either be put up there or links will be put up there that would allow people to listen to the MP3 that we'll be making and things like that.
Well, as fast as you can get them up, I think you'll have thousands of our listeners clicking through to download those MP3s.
Well, I appreciate that.
Well, Dr. Keyes, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And we'll look forward to perhaps having you back. We'd love to see you in the Oval Office if that's something that the people will ever consent to. We hope that the educational process gets speeded up and more awareness is there of the changes that need to occur, and that courage is something that people will practice in the political process.
I certainly hope so. I think one of the things that could help to turn this country around completely is the day we have an election where the outcome completely surprises those who have manipulated the system.
We're looking forward to that day. Well, you've been listening to the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. I'm Kevin Orrick, along with David McAlvany and our guest, Dr. Alan Keyes. You can join us at McAlvany.com, McAlvany.com, or feel free to call us at 800-525-9556. Thanks for listening.
This has been the McAlvany Weekly Commentary. The views expressed should not be considered to be a solicitation or a recommendation for your investment portfolio. You should consult a professional financial advisor to assess your suitability for risk and investment. Join us again next week for a new edition of the McAlvany Weekly Commentary.